The key to cracking coding interviews is understanding what companies seek in their potential hires. Top tech companies typically assess candidates across 4 areas. In this video, we'll look at what those 4 axes are, how to get high scores in each of them, and how to solve the coding question during an interview, from clarifying the problem to suggesting a brute force solution, and finally coming up with an optimal and efficient solution. Let's see what are companies looking for during the interview. The obvious one is your coding skills. Of course, you're going to write some code during your interview. This part is your pure code, which means can you write clean, readable, real-world code that looks like production quality. And this doesn't have to do anything with your solution. Doesn't matter if your solution is right or wrong. Next part is your communication skills. Even if you solve the problem, you still have to communicate. This means when you're coding during the interview, they want to hear your thought process and how you go from not knowing the answer to solving the problem. Next is the design part, or your analytical skills. This is your ability to analyze the given problem, figure out requirements by asking clarifying questions, suggest solutions, and also be able to analyze the time and space complexities of your proposed solution. And the big part is data structures and algorithms. This is to get the problem right and solve it. The most crucial part here is choosing the right data structure. So in order to solve interview problems, you must first know the basics of data structures and algorithms, which as you can see is not a lot, and you can learn the basics in a month or two. I regularly publish videos about these topics, so you can check out my other videos and also do some lead code to get familiar with coding questions. Once you do practice, you will recognize variations of questions easily. Now let's see the steps we need to take to solve the coding problems during the interview to get high scores in each of these aspects that the interviewer is looking for. But instead of me just mentioning the steps that you have to take, let's solve one interview coding problem and practice on that problem. If you don't know data structures and algorithms well yet, or specific language that will be used, you can still watch this video. The point is to understand the steps that you need to take and not the exact problem or the language syntax. So let's say we are given 2 arrays and we need to create a function that lets a user know whether these 2 arrays contain any common items. For example, if we have these 2 arrays, one with a, b, c, x and the other one with z, y, I, we should return false because there are no common items in those 2 arrays. However, if we have those 2 arrays with a, b, c, x and z, y, x, we can see that x is a common item in both of these arrays and the function should return true. So an interviewer asked you this question, how do you go about solving it? And keep in mind that you have from 45 to 60 minutes for solving this problem. That's the typical tech interview duration. The first part is to ask clarifying questions and make sure you got the problem right. As a first step, repeat the problem and also bring 1 to 2 examples. You can say, okay, let me repeat the question and see if I got the problem right. And repeat whatever you understood from the question, plus bring your own example. If there are any problems with your understanding of the problem, your interviewer will point them out here. That's better than jumping into code and then realizing that you've been going in the wrong direction. Secondly, make sure you double check the inputs and the outputs of your problem. Ask if the arrays will contain string items or if they could be integers or floating numbers. Can it be a string or object, or we will always get arrays? If the arrays can contain integers, are they sorted or not, and so on. And for the output, make sure you double check the return type, whether it should be yes or no, a boolean or something else. So in our case, we clarified that we have 2 inputs, which are always arrays of strings, and our output will be true or false boolean value. The next step is to clarify the goal of our problem. In most cases, the goal is to optimize for time complexity, but for some scenarios, you may have to optimize for more space. Maybe the arrays are very large and they won't fit the memory. But let's say, as in most cases, for this question, the interviewer asks to optimize for efficiency rather than for space. And lastly, you can ask about the size of the inputs, because if they are too big, they may not fit the memory. Most of the time though, the interviewer will confirm that it fits the memory. In this part, remember to keep your questions to a minimum. Ask only the necessary questions. After you got the requirements, it's time to suggest solutions. Start with the brute force way and talk about the time and space complexity of it. It doesn't have to be perfect, this is just the easiest and first one that comes to our mind. So here you might say we can have two nested for loops where we compare a with z and then a with y and then a with x, and then we move this first pointer to b and we compare b with z and so on, and give the analysis of time and space complexity to explain why it's not efficient. So for the time complexity we will have O of a times b here, where a is the size of the first array and b is the size of the second array. And for space we will have O of 1, because we are not using any additional space. You don't need to code the brute force during the interview, that will waste your time. Just tell them why this approach is not the best and move on. Now that you identified why the brute force solution is inefficient, you need to suggest a better alternative. Most of the times, the solution to avoid nested loops is to use hash maps. So here you may suggest having a function that takes the first array and converts it into a hash map, where the keys will be the array's items and the values will be just a true boolean. And then we can iterate over the second array and search the current item in this object. If we find one that matches, we will return true. Here you also need to give time and space analysis before moving on. So for the time we will have O of a plus b, and for space we will have O of a, because we are allocating memory for this object, which is the size of the first array. That's why it's essential to clarify this at the beginning, because if we are optimizing for more space, the first solution would have been better here. And as you can see, the most crucial part here is choosing the right data structure. If the interviewer likes your solution, they will ask you to proceed, otherwise you may have to rethink and modify your solution a bit. After you have the optimal solution, it's time to implement it in code. Here you will be evaluated on the coding part, so make sure your code looks clean, and if you're going to use any helper method in your code, it's a good practice to create a class and use public-private methods to also demonstrate that you know OOP. Start by creating a class called solution. If you're using dynamically typed language like JavaScript, instead of private methods, just use underscore method and tell that this is a private method. Don't waste too much time here. Do not seek perfection here, code fast, you will fine tune it at the end if you have time. Make sure to handle edge cases, like when the array is empty or undefined or anything like that, and try to extract away the methods or data structures and implement them later when you have time. And lastly, if you have some time left, you should test your code. First test your code with the given examples and make sure it works. And then check for edge cases, like when there are no parameters or inputs are undefined, and make sure that your code works in all cases and handles edge cases. If your interviewer is happy with the solution, the interview usually ends here. By following all these steps, you get high scores from your interviewer on all of these 4 aspects that we've talked about in the beginning, because your interviewer is taking notes about these while you're solving the problem. If you're interested about how to analyze the time and space complexities of your code, I recommend clicking on this video about Big O time and space analysis next.